A very good evening to you, and a warm welcome to Weston Road Methodist Church for our annual Lent lecture. Especially if you've traveled from a very far part of the district to be with us, you are very warmly welcome here. In the season of Lent, Christians are invited to slow down, be more intentional about their relationship with God, and take on the character of Christ, and share the experience of the cross with the help of the Holy Spirit. This spirit-led and cross-shaped process of transformation by which we grow into Christ-likeness is what is called the spirituality of the cross. The call to become more like Christ means that, like the first Christians, we too must learn to deny ourselves, take up our crosses, and follow Jesus. This involves growing into a way of life characterized by learning, repentance, sacrifice, self-denial, as well as joy, peace, and intimacy with God. The idea of Lent lecture is simply to kickstart this Lenten spiritual formation by drawing people from all churches in Bellariki, Wickford, and beyond together here to share an experience of learning together. The talk is given by a biblical scholar or a theologian standing within the Christian faith. And the aim is to make cutting-edge scholarship accessible to lay people by bridging academia and church in order to inspire, enthuse, and enable the people of God to encounter afresh the transforming power of the living and active Jesus. Well, I'm very delighted this evening to introduce Dr. Ash Cocksworth as our speaker this evening. Dr. Cocksworth is reader in theology and practice at the University of Roehampton, having previously taught at Durham University and Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, where I met Ash. Ash has written a number of books, including the Calbath on Prayer, Prayer, A Guide for the Perplexed, and Glorification and the Life of Faith, co-authored with David Ford. He's also co-edited a number of books, including the T&T Clark Handbook of Christian Prayer, Calbath, Spiritual Writings in the Classics of Western Spirituality series, which, if you haven't come across, is a pretty prestigious series which collects a lot of medieval spirituality in a very handy, accessible way. And it could be a very good bedtime reading. Ash has also edited the book From Shores of Silence, Conversations in Feminist Practical Theology, and recently the Modern Theologians, an Introduction to Christian Theology since 1918. Again, a wonderful edition, started initially by David Ford, but David, I think, has given up, and his students, like Ash, have taken on the mantle. That's great. When I get to know Ash, I know Ash has been doing a lot of work on prayer in Christian tradition, and most of his early writings has been on prayer. I said to him, would you like to come and do something on prayer during Lent? To which he responded, I have moved on from prayer, I'm now into joy. So I didn't realize prayer was painful. Dr. Cocksworth's title for his talk this evening is The Passion of Joy, Enjoying God in Lent. Ash will speak for roughly 45 to 50 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes answer and question session. So please do jot down any thoughts, ideas that comes to you during Ash's talk. And try and keep your questions succinct and focused so we can get in a lot of questions tonight. And for any avoidance of doubt, a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end. At the end of our evening together, there will be refreshment for us to enjoy together and to share further conversation with Ash. Finally, before I say a short, brief word of prayer, please do check your phones and make sure that they are on silence, or you might want to ask Alexa to turn it off for you if you are inclined, that's inclined. Let's pray. Almighty God, by your gift alone we come to wisdom and true understanding. Look with favor, we pray, on our gathering this evening, that knowledge may be increased among us and wholesome learning flourish and abound. Bless Ash with insight and bless our listening, and grant that in humility of heart we may evermore look to you, the fountain of all wisdom, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you so much. It's a huge privilege and honour to be giving this lecture. I'm taking my jacket off, which means I'm getting serious now. But I always get a bit unnerved, actually, when I receive emails from former students, because I think, oh, yikes, what kind of damage have I inflicted on students in my lecturing many moons ago? I think it was about 10 years ago or something, wasn't it, Moses? So I'm really pleased to be here and to reconnect with Moses and see that despite my lecturing many moons ago, Moses is flourishing and doing all sorts of great work here. As Moses said, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about prayer and writing about prayer. I still like to pray, just for the record, but I've moved on to think of some other themes, and joy is one of my other themes that I'm thinking about at the moment, and that's partly because it's really the same thing that interested me about prayer. Joy, like prayer, is something that's really, really important to the actual living of the Christian life. Part of my argument today is that joy is really at the very centre of what it means to practice as a Christian. And I even go so far as to say, Christianity is a religion of joy, and that should be its primary purpose in the world. The ways in which the church and Christians can image joy and model joy to the world. I see no more important work in the life of the church. So I quite like theological themes that kind of touch in the realm of practice, and joy's a really good one to get thinking of some big theological issues, but also, I hope, some matters of theological importance that touch the heart as well as the mind. So here we go. I've got, this is, by the way, you are my guinea pigs, okay? This is pretty much brand new material. I was in Berlin, I was saying to Moses this week, and I took advantage of the two plane journeys to put some ideas down on paper that I've been wrestling with for quite a long time. But this is the first time I've kind of spoken them out loud. I tested them out on my wife when we were walking around the park, and she said they're okay. So we'll see how they go, but I'm really interested in the conversation afterwards to see what you make of these ideas and what we can do. Moses, can you keep an eye on time?
Yeah.
And maybe give me 5 minutes heads up when it's time to land, as it were. But my fundamental question, and this is a book that I started writing during lockdown, and I'm only really, this is the way things work. You have to clear other commitments before you can get writing the thing that you really want to be writing about. But during lockdown, I felt that this is a time when actually Christians need to think very seriously about joy and what it means to live lives of joy, not only during the good times, but also during the despairing times, during the suffering times. It's taken me up until this point really to do some serious thinking to get me to this point. But one of my big questions in the book is, what is joy? And what I mean by that is not so much what brings you joy, or how to form communities for joy, but what sort of a thing is joy? And there's been a whole bunch of different responses over the course of the Christian tradition, and more broadly, it can be an experience, it can be a feeling, it can be an emotion. And we tend these days to think of joy primarily as an emotion. Thanks, Martin. Martin's my glamorous assistant this evening with the slides. So I don't know if you could quite work out on these slides, but these are, I think these two slides kind of represent a dominant way of understanding what joy is, and that's to think of it as an emotion. There's a great deal of debate that begins to explore what an emotion actually is. But most people think that joy is one of them. Most theologians, I mean by that. Some psychologists think that we're all born with a set of what they call basic emotions that are universal and hardwired into us. Others think that emotions emerge through a much more complex process of cultural and social conditioning. There are two big schools of thoughts within theories of the emotion in psychology. Whatever their origins, most people understand joy as a positive emotion, with some arguing that joy is the most positive emotion. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. These slides, I don't know if you recognise them. The top one is one of these Disney Pixar things, Inside Out, and is a really clever articulation of basic emotion theory. In fact, if you go through and watch the film, at the end they give credit to this guy called Paul Ekman, who's an American psychologist, and he's pretty much credited with this whole idea of big emotions. It existed before him, but he's the one who made big bucks of theorising this idea. And you can see just about the joys in the middle there, and notice how joy's upside down. I think that's quite significant. And something to think about. The other one is a piece of modern art by an artist that I can't remember, but if your eyesight's better than me, then that's the person there in the bottom right hand corner. And I think this is a really useful description of how basic emotion theory tends to put emotions in boxes. In discrete and different boxes. And the one closest to me, the side closest to me, is the kind of happiness end of things. And you can see joy is either the top one or near the top. I think it might be, is it happiness right at the top? And then joy is, anyway, on this kind of far positive side. The other far side is the negative emotions. That's also really important within basic emotion theory. Emotions aren't just distinguished from each other, but tend to sit in two different camps, positive and negative. However, and this is my big however, the word emotion, despite it being the dominant way of understanding a whole bunch of things like joy, doesn't feature in the Bible. And it doesn't feature in the longer history of Christian theological literature either, or indeed any other form of literature. And that's because thinking of human experience as the emotions, as it were, arrives very historically late in the day, around the 18th century. When I've been doing some research for my book, I found this like one of the real moments of breakthrough, because I'd taken for granted that joy is an emotion, as many theologians have. But to think actually the emotions as a category, as a way of thinking about the nature of who we are and our feelings and our experiences, the mysteries of human psychology, that's a recent invention in terms of the history. And as a modern invention, the idea of the emotions is the product of quite a complex process of secularization. And that's also important. What that means is that emotions such as joy tend to be taken out of a broader theological context. a theological narrative, I think, of sin and salvation, and they're left to stand alone, either as a basic emotion that we're all born with, or as something that just emerges naturally through social conditioning. Now, that's a really complex claim and a long history, and there's significant scholarship in that area. But part of my aim today is to show that I think thinking about joy as an emotion is a rather flat way of understanding joy. It doesn't really plumb the depths of what I think joy is. Joy is infinitely more interesting when it's understood theologically. There we go, great. So before there were emotions, there were these things called passions. And that's the title of my lecture today, The Passion of Joy. Indeed, up until the invention of the idea of the emotions in the 18th century, the main way of understanding what we now call emotions was through this framework of the passions of the soul. If you need some Lenten reading, then Rowan Williams has just this month published this book called The Passions of the Soul. And it's classic Rowan Williams in the sense that it's brilliant, I think. And it's well worth a read. I don't completely agree with all of the way that he's framing this, but it's difficult to argue with someone of Rowan Williams' reputation. But it is a really great book and a thoroughly practical and theological book too. One advantage of the passions, I think, rather than the emotions, is that the passions offer a level of descriptiveness that is lost when everything is just flattened into this idea of a kind of massive overarching idea that we call the emotions. One of the great heroes doesn't feature in Rowan Williams' book because he doesn't quite cover up until this bit in history, but Thomas Aquinas is the man for writing on the passions of the soul. He wrote this huge, great big Summa Theologica, which is a massive, great big book, and the largest volume is his treatment of the passions of the soul, and it's an extraordinarily rich account of what we now just call the emotions. There's stuff to do with the affections, there's stuff to do with feelings and experiences and movements of the heart, and all sorts. And these all have complex subcategories and further distinctions, and each means subtly different things. Yet everything, all of this rich descriptiveness, just gets boiled down into this, I think, rather singular and flat idea of the emotions. So that's one sort of loss, a loss of a descriptive range that you find in the passions, but not in the emotions. Now, this is a visual articulation of a way of understanding the passions. And you can just pick up a few things, I think, of the differences between the passions and, the diagrams earlier on of the basic emotion theory, that you can see that all of these different passions are kind of chained together. And I think that's quite an important point, that these emotions don't sit in boxes, that they, inhabit in and of themselves, but are part of a much more complex kind of system, a much more complex relationship with each other. But also, and I like this, is almost a kind of comedy description of not only what the feeling, not only what the passion is, but what the feeling might look like in order to emulate. And that says something very significant about the nature of the passions, that they're also bodily things. They're not just matters of the heart, they're things of the body that move our body and charge our body. And I can't remember what joy has. I think it's not very Lenten, so you have to forgive it. But I think it's probably some wine or something. And you'll see how joy, the figure there, is high up in terms of the kind of pecking order. So another loss, as I've already indicated, is the loss of theology when it comes to thinking about the emotions. You can talk about the emotions without needing to talk about theology, whereas the passions are only made sense of in light of the history of salvation. And you get this in the image. The chains suggest both the connectiveness of the different feelings, the different passions. But these, the chains also signals, I think, that these are, in a sense, prisoners, and they need the regulation, or in Christian terms, they need a sense of formation. They need a sense of transformation of both reason, and you'll see there's a figure of reason that's just above the passions in control of these chains, and also divine grace, which is right at the top, to keep these emotions on track. And Rowan Williams explores this in his book, how, and this is why it's a good Lenten book, how these passions do need a sense of formation, of transformation, to be reworked from within by divine grace. So part of what it means to think theologically about the passion of joy, I think, is to think of it in terms of gift, and to think of it especially in terms of a gift of God. Charles Wesley gets this, and I thought I'd get in a Methodist reference. So this is the Methodist reference, and it's in his Love Divine. Now, I used to do this actually whenever I showed Wesley hymns in my lectures at Queen's, which was Anglicans and Methodists training for various forms. The class would break out in song. I'm not encouraging you to do that today, but that's certainly something that happened a lot at Queen's. And this line of, I think it's the second or first verse maybe, but love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. So joy isn't just something that we're born with, and neither is it a happy coincidence of human sociality and community. Instead, it comes to us from heaven to earth as gift. And that's a really amazing thing to think about, that when we experience joy, we experience a gift of God. Moreover, when we experience joy, we experience something of God. That's what's given. The God of joy gives God's self as joy to be felt in our lives. From the Latin word passion, and I've got this down here, it also translates in Greek pathos, we get the word passive. And that passive dynamic is, again, something that I think characterises a theology of joy. It's something received, it's something given to us as pure gift by God, as God. The God of Jesus Christ is the God of joy, and to receive joy is to receive God in our hearts. This is the glory of God that's radiating from God and radiating to us as joy. And that's just another interesting difference between the language of the passions, which prioritises this passivity, this reception from outside, and the language of emotions, which has that more kind of active dimension, the motiveness of joy. And I just think that's an astonishing idea, and it's a great thing to think through theologically. Every time we feel joy in our lives, we feel something of the presence of God flowing with us. And that changes us from glory to glory. As a gift, joy is a gift that we don't possess for long, but we pass it on. In my family, I've got 2 girls, and we're at that stage of parenting when pass the parcel is the best game ever. I'm going to revise that. I don't think it's the best game ever. Sleeping Lions. Do you play this game ever? Whoever came up, that's proof for the existence of God, that game, because it's an absolute genius to get a bunch of hyperactive 3-year-olds, in my case, sleeping away. But the dynamic of pass the parcel isn't unlike what I'm saying about joy. You receive it, you enjoy it, and then you pass it on. However tempting it is, especially for one of my daughters, to cling on to that parcel in the hope that you're going to get to hold the gift for a little bit longer. And like pass the parcel, the gifts keep coming and circulating in endless rounds of exchange. There's always more. Psychologists say that joy has a high contagion factor, and that's what they mean by that is that it can spread through communities very successfully and very quickly. And it has this particular characteristic of getting thicker rather than thinner the further it spreads. So it's not like spreading we're having hot cross buns. It's not like spreading butter on your hot cross buns in the sense that it gets thinner the more you spread. It gets thicker the more it spreads, which says something about the abundance of joy. This is a gift from God and reflects the abundance of the God who gives it. So the passion of joy is passive in the sense it's receiving something, the gift of joy, but it's also an active sort of passivity. Passion is a term that's used to denote a strong, sometimes barely controllable inclination to do something. And there is then this active strand which introduces a much broader idea of what I mean by the passion of joy, and that's the passion for joy. The passion towards passionate action for justice and peace to flow in the world. So what does it mean to think of the passion of joy as something that you're passionate about, that you're actively seeking and wanting to spread in the community in ever richer ways? In fact, and as I said at the beginning, I think one of the most important things that Christians should be doing is passionately spreading joy in the world, creating spaces where joy can flow through communities, sharing joy with others, and working against anything that blocks the flow of joy in the world. And it's a question I often ask in my local church. How is this a place of joy? How are we creating spaces for others to enjoy each other and enjoy God? Irenaeus, who's an early church father, he's got this great line. He says, "The glory of God is human being fully alive." And I think another way of saying what he's saying there is that human being is joyfully alive. Where there's the glory of God flowing in people's lives, people are full of joy. So what I'm saying then is that joy is utterly central to the Christian tradition. And I think that's a message that's worth holding on to, especially because Christianity is often, from the outside, seen to be a religion that's about judgment, it's about hell, it's about guilt, and it's about sin. And it is, all those things too, but primarily it's a religion of joy, and that gets at the very heart of what I think the Christian tradition is all about. But this vision of the good life comes with some risks and some problems. So this is my kind of next section, really. I'm looking at some problems with joy, and I think there are two big problems with joy. They're not insurmountable problems, by the way, but it's part of what it means, I think, to think of joy responsibly in the world in which we live. And the first one is the political problem, as I'm calling it. The great German theologian Jürgen Moltmann expresses the political problem with joy really well in this book. Is it Theology and Joy, or Theology of Joy, or something? And it's a very short book, but he asks, and I think he begins with this line: how can we laugh and rejoice when there are so many tears to be wiped away, and when new tears are being added every day? How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Complained already in Psalm 137. How can one rejoice when innocent people are killed in Vietnam? How can one laugh and play when children are starving in Africa? How can we dance when the prisoners of Latin American military dictatorships, human beings are being tortured and disappear? Don't we live in one world? Do we have a right to joy if we do not cry out for those who suffer? Now, Moltmann was writing this in and you can kind of pick on the references, the political references, in 1973. And think of all that's happened since 1973. I don't think the world has got any better. And there's no doubt in my mind that we're living in a darkening time, politically and ecologically, socially, technologically, economically. The big issue that I'm trying to work through in this book that I'm writing at the moment on joy is whether it's responsible to be thinking about joy, whether it's intellectually responsible, ethically and politically responsible to spend so much time writing on joy when, looking around us, the world is in such a state of despair. And that's a genuine wrestle that I'm trying to think through. We move so rapidly from crisis to crisis that we find ourselves living in this age of permia-crisis, constantly in this moment of crisis. And it's a very despairing place to be. And I think it's a real challenge to be able to create spaces for joy, to carve out spaces for joy in such an age of despair. I still haven't got the title for the book, but I think my working title at the moment is Joy in an Age of Despair. How can you talk about joy in the age in which we live? Indeed, there's been loads of research, more in psychology and sociology, on how society is very finely tuned to form us in a negative bias. Think back on that earlier slide with the inside-out characters. There was one positive emotion, joy, flanked either side by two negative emotions. And that's representative of, I think, a general, what I call bleakness of the world. And I'm thinking here of, the daily news cycle. I had to give up listening to the Today programme on Radio 4 just because I found it. And I've moved over to Radio 2. And honestly, my world is a little bit better because I listen to some good music in the morning rather than Radio 4, which was just so bleak. Or doom scrolling through Twitter. This is a thing. People spend hours just scrolling through intense negativity. Now, I don't know whether I'm just kind of showing my age or something, but I remember the 10 o'clock news always ended with an "and finally, the world's really bad, but something nice happened." And I think it's lost that. I don't think it goes straight for the kind of negativity and the bleakness. There's a loss there, I think. So this is the world that we live in, and this is the political context in which we live and work and have our being. And to speak about joy and to push it so strongly as I am, really requires someone to think very carefully about the political appropriateness of talking about joy. Theologians are generally quite a bleak bunch, I should add. There haven't been many books on joy. This, in fact, I think was the last major book on joy, and that was 1973, and it's quite a small book. Theologians also like to write really big books, so I think it's suggestive that it hasn't captured the imagination of theologians. Theologians love to write about trauma and sin and death and dying and whatever else, evil, but not joy. And we're caught up in the same dynamic of being formed in this, what psychologists call a negative bias. So that's the first one, the political problem. The next one is a little bit more risky, and this is an idea that I'm not quite sure of, so remember the guinea pig thing at the beginning. And I call it the positivity problem. It's a related problem. Martin, actually, this is the next... There we go, great. A related sort of problem to the political problem is what I'm calling oppressive positivity. This is when joy is so positive that it can't face the trauma of the world. An example of the extreme positivity of joy can be found in the so-called happiness industry, which is, genuinely big money in the States. And it came about actually towards the end of the 70s is when it kind of began to really take hold. So, not long after Moltmann was writing his book. This is a kind of more pop psychology book, but quite helpful in showing how big a business the happiness industry is and how much it permeates all aspects of life, including church life. Now, theologians also like to kind of get very fussed on distinctions and differences, and there's a long discourse between that articulates the difference between joy and happiness. And I think there is probably a difference, but I'm not quite sure. I'm preempting the questions, by the way. I'm not quite sure what that difference exactly is. But there's this very famous American sociologist, he's called Peter Berger, and he, I think, satirizes the insatiable positivity of church life through his idea of what he calls the Protestant smile. And it's a really great idea. But he says this characterizes so much of American church life. And it's the idea of when you go into church, everyone's smiling. And Peter Berger says, there's nothing more terrifying than walking into a church and seeing everyone smiling. He thinks it's completely terrifying. It's a little bit like the way the smiley functions in everyday life as a sort of omnipotent and omnipresent reminder to be happy. And this Protestant smile, as Peter Berger calls it, signals the relentless pressure to feel joy always, as Paul writes, no matter what else is going on. As others have argued, and I think it's deeply problematic, actually, this culture of happiness. And this is why I'm trying to speak of something quite different to whatever's going on in the happiness industry and whatever Peter Berger saw in the churches that he was associated with is, such pressure to rejoice always leads to joy fatigue, and people give up on it. They become killjoys, and there's a whole discourse on how killing joy is actually the most politically appropriate response to the world in which we live, but also psychologically a healthy way of acting and living. This relentless pressure to be happy always just doesn't really work. I told you theologians are kind of bleak people, wanting to kill off joy. But thinking of joy as an emotion means, I think, thinking of joy as always and exclusively positive. And not only positive, but very positive, the most positive of positive emotions. And under these conditions, joy can feel a little bit like an escapism from the trauma of the world. And that's, again, another version of the political problem. Is it that the more you feel joyous, the more you're kind of extracting yourself from the messy realities of the world? And here, joy could quickly descend into inaction, disempowering us to act against anything that tackles the sources of despair. It can be another strategy for the management rather than the overcoming of suffering. However, and this is my big idea, when joy is understood not as an emotion but a passion, joy doesn't get fixed so neatly to positive feeling. Passions aren't simply positive or simply negative, but something much more ambiguous, neither here nor there, as it were. And I think this complexity provides some really helpful ways for thinking about joy, not least in the way that it helps both to avoid the political problem that Moltmann articulates and this problem of positivity that I've talked about earlier on. So earlier I said that passions meant passivity. As well as meaning to receive, the Greek word is pathos, which means suffering. It's the word from which we get our word to suffer. And it's also the word that Paul and other writers of the New Testament tended to speak of to describe Christ's suffering, Christ's pathos. And following the way of Christ, Paul speaks in Thessalonians of his own prison experience as a form of pathos, a form of suffering. And I want to expand on that and think about it in a little bit more detail. Indeed, one of the really curious things about the Christian tradition is that when theologians do write about joy, they tend to write about joy in the context of suffering. And they pair joy and suffering together. And I want to think about that a little bit more, but hold in your mind the two problems. Problem one, the political problem. Problem two, the positivity problem. And we can think about those in relation to my next section, which is on joy and suffering. In many ways, it's odd, even in Lent, to want to find joy in suffering. It's a really strange idea when you think about it. And there are all sorts of problems. It could make a good of suffering. It could make suffering into something less than suffering, because some good comes from it. Suffering is no longer all that bad, because it comes with this kind of silver lining of joy. Yet so many theologians throughout the Christian tradition have reflected on the paradox of joy and suffering. And you could even see the paradox of joy and suffering at the heart of what the Christian tradition is all about. It's always been about finding meaning, even new life, in the darkness of suffering and loss. No matter how bad the world is, nothing can extinguish the light of joy, because that light is God. Perhaps the most famous example of the person who reflected on this most significantly is the Apostle Paul, and here he is in his prison cell. In Philippians, if you can make out the chart, Paul expresses several strong feelings, and actually it's very interesting. Philippians is only a short book, and it's quite interesting to read it with the idea of these emotions in mind, these feelings, and it's a very affectively rich document. And Paul talks about all sorts of strong feelings, including worry and grief and distress. But the greatest of all of these is joy. And the prisoner, Paul, speaks about joy a lot, and he repeats the word and its derivatives, I think something like 16 times, depending on how you're going to cut the cake. And to such an extent that Pauline scholars talk about the letter to the Philippians as the letter of joy. That's kind of what it's known in the Christian traditions. You know, think of how he writes, yes, I will rejoice, and later he commands others to rejoice in the Lord always. Now, it's easy to forget when you're reading these words and this, massive affirmation of joy that Paul was writing all of this in prison. So we read the text and think, actually, this is a person who's writing in prison, and think of the rough treatment that he would have likely endured during his incarceration, affliction, constraint, distress, beatings, deprivation, humiliation. All of this context makes his claim that he not only rejoiced in prison, but rejoiced greatly, he says, even more remarkable. It's interesting to notice what Paul, who's known, this is the letter of joy, he's known as the joyful prisoner, is what is interesting and important to note what he is saying and what he's not saying. So he's not saying, I'm enjoying this suffering that he's under. And this is a really important theological point. He's not saying, because of this suffering, or he's not saying, because of this joy, I'm no longer suffering. The suffering remains and remains suffering. Instead, he's speaking of joy a little bit like a candle flickering in the fragility of the night, rather than saying joy is like, these big floodlights. I drove past the football ground and saw the floodlights. It's not that sort of imagery that Paul's talking about here. It's a candle that flickers in the midst of the night. That's there and can't be put out. But it's not a feeling that just floods the world with this overwhelming brightness. He puts it elsewhere in Corinthians that he's sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. And I think that's kind of getting closer to what I think he's doing here. And I call this dynamic joy amid and despite suffering. It's not joy because of suffering, but it's joy amid suffering and despite it. It's joy against all the odds. So suffering here doesn't cause joy, but yet in the midst of it and despite it, against all the odds, there is joy because, as Bonhoeffer would say, where there is suffering, there is God, and where there is God, there is joy. And that's such an important point in the history of the Christian tradition, that where there is suffering in the world, that's where you're going to find God. That's where you're going to find God's grace and God's glory. In fact, Paul goes on to say that he not only finds joy for himself in Philippians, but also for others, supporting others in their joy through this letter writing, and himself being supported by others through receiving letters. So this very correspondence is bringing Paul joy. And that's actually, I think, really important part of Paul's prison experience. Although prison was a place of solitude, joy is still a social matter. It's still larger than the confines in which he found himself. He's spurred by the joyful anticipation of his rescue and the hope of his reunion with his friends and community, and he's also empowered and encouraged by the memories of past joys. And I think that's a very human response, how our memories can recreate feelings in us. And psychologists speak about this, of recalling joy. However, the ultimate provocation for Paul's prison joy is not social, through the community that he's receiving, but Christological. And so he has this massive Christological affirmation that joy is joy in the Lord. And that's what really matters to Paul. And I think Paul is doing something a little bit more complex than simply saying that Jesus Christ is the source of joy, or even that joy is a form of participation in the life of Christ, which is another one of Paul's big themes, how we participate in life. It's about being drawn into Christ's joy, the joy that the Son shares with the Father. And also the resurrection promise that it's joy, not suffering, that has the final word. And Paul is writing this with the knowledge that the resurrection has happened and that suffering will have its time and will end. Von Balthasar, who's this Roman Catholic theologian, he's got this really intriguing essay on joy, and he compares the joy that John would have experienced in the Gospel of John and the way that Paul experiences joy in the context of his prison. And Paul was writing his Philippians letter with the knowledge that Christ had resurrected. John was experiencing joy in the midst of suffering. And von Balthasar says that's a more costly form of joy, knowing that the suffering might not end. But Paul, whatever he's doing, he's writing, from the perspective of his own encounter with the risen Lord. So Paul is the prototype, but there are many other figures in the history of the Christian tradition who think roughly along the same lines by speaking of the experience of joy amid and despite suffering. And these are just some of them. There's Bonhoeffer, who himself was imprisoned, and he writes his letters and papers from Tegel prison in Berlin, and he takes on this sort of Pauline disposition. It's a curious thing it's a good book to be, once you finish reading Rowan Williams' book on the Passions, rereading Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from the perspective of joy is a really intriguing thing, and it's filtered through so much of what he's saying. But there are others too. There is, outside of the prison context, you can follow this trajectory even further. The book of Marjorie Kempt, which is this slightly tearful figure here. This was the first autobiography written in English, by the way, and it was written around, kind of early 15th century. And she's got a really kind of strong sense of joy amidst affliction. And it comes up time and time again. Also in Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the father of Latin American liberation theology, in his Spirituality of Liberation, he works from the experience of those living under the conditions of oppression and poverty to speak of joy, in the slums of the Latin American context in which he was living and ministering. Gutierrez is also really important for my discussion, as one of the main advances I think you can find in his account is that there is this very strong bias towards passionate action against suffering. So he speaks of joy as energizing an ethic of resistance against suffering, united around a common cause of God's justice on earth as it is in heaven. And he says of resurrection joy, this is a quote, "In no sense is it an evasion of concrete history. On the contrary, joy leads to a redoubling of effort in the struggle against what brings unjust death." So this is a response to, I think, the political problem, that joy isn't an escape from the world, it's a more intensive engagement with it. And I'm going to follow Gutierrez and push him in a little bit of another direction towards the end of this. Anyway, finding joy in suffering is a deeply biblical and theological theme, because I think it's a deeply human one. I'm running a project at the moment at my university that's working with some of the local Roehampton churches, Anglican churches in the Roehampton area. And I don't know if anyone listens to the BBC Radio 4 programme, The Listening Project. Do you know this one? It's a really interesting thing, and it's just kind of two people and they record a conversation about anything really, and it kind of punctuates the Radio 4 programme. And we've borrowed that framework to go to some of the local Roehampton churches and get hold of some joyful Anglicans. And it's been quite difficult to find any joyful Anglicans. but I have managed to find 10 joyful Anglicans. I need to find another 10 to make the funders happy. So the first thing I'm doing on Monday, actually, is to go on a hunt for these joyful. So if you know any joyful Anglicans, then send them my way. But what we do, we set up a conversation, and it's among older Christians, so over 70s in the Roehampton area. I've got into a bit of trouble actually going into some churches and asking if people would like to be part of this project, and people saying, I'm only 62 or something, so that's got me in a lot of trouble. But we go for the older Anglicans, and we record conversations with them, just between friends, in the churches that were shut during lockdown, to get them to reflect back on their experiences of joy in the midst of the pandemic, and how they experienced joy, and what gave them hope and gave them happiness. And the insights that we're getting from that project is that even in the context of the pandemic, which is a particular form of bleakness and despair, there was still joy. There was a real sense that people were clinging on to joy, and everyday joy, as we're talking about it. And that's one of the things that the pandemic did. It kind of stripped us away from all of the things that we think we might find joy in. And people found joy in doing the most everyday, ordinary sorts of things. And that's one of the things that we're thinking through in terms of the project. But it's roughly a Pauline idea that within contexts of suffering and despair, there still is joy. Joy goes on. So joy in the Christian tradition is experienced amid, despite, and it gets mixed up with suffering. But the question of the relationship between joy and suffering is generally still approached from a single direction. The ideas that I surveyed, Bonhoeffer, Paul, Gutierrez, Marjorie Kemp, and these elusive breed of joyful Anglicans, they're all thinking of joy in terms of finding joy in contexts of suffering. What I'm trying to do in the book is to flip that round a little bit and to wonder whether it's also possible, if it's a strong feature in the Christian tradition, to find joy in suffering, whether you can flip that paradox so that the focus shifts from finding joy in suffering to finding a particular sort of suffering in joy. And I find that a really helpful way of resisting the first two problems that I identified, the political problem and the problem of positivity, because now joy isn't so fixed to positive emotion. It's something much more complex. So this is the real guinea pig moment, all right, and I'm going to see if it works in practice. So earlier I said that passion means both receiving the gift of joy and it also means suffering. This is my big question. Can it also be said that the passion of joy has in and of itself a particular sort of pathos? The psalmist speaks of the fullness of joy, and one of my big questions is joy capacious enough? Is it large enough to include a sense of suffering within itself? And if not full-on suffering, then at least a sense of ambiguity. And we can go back actually to this figure here, and I think this the positioning of joy here, we get a bit of a close-up so we can see it is in fact wine that is bringing this particular figure fully alive. But you can see actually in the posturing of this figure, joy can go one way or the other way. It can go towards the negative side of fear, or it can also go upwards towards divine grace and therefore to the glory of God. In other words, when thinking about joy as passions, you can see the figure of joy here as caught in a sense between good and evil, pointing to fear with one hand and up to this higher realm of reason with the other. So joy is kind of in this permanent tension between these two modes. Bonhoeffer, in his one of his prison poems, is called Sorrow and Joy, and it was written in June 1944, and that would have been he died on the 9th of April 1945, which was just 2 weeks before the liberation of the concentration camp that he was that he was being held. Sorrow and Joy, it's written in June 1944, and it's pretty much the last that comes from the book Letters and Papers, because at that point, it's maybe later on in the summer, in July or August, he gets moved from Tegel prison to a much harsher prison, which is where he waits for his death or for the liberation of the prison, whichever comes sooner. And he gets taken away his right to write. And he enjoyed a certain level of privilege in the Tegel prison, but by the time he gets to the prison where he would spend his final few months, he can't have any correspondence with the outside world. So we don't really know much of what happens there. So this is in the last few months there. And he says that joy and sorrow can feel somewhat similar. He says, as frost and heat at the first keen contact can burn us alike. And he says that's also something a little bit like joy. It can feel both frosty and heaty. And sometimes he says they're even indistinguishable from each other. They feel the same. They come with, he says, equally potent. They're equally potent in their power and terror. He says that sorrow has its sweetness, and crucially, this is my key point, joy is rich in its fears. Sorrow has its sweetness, and joy is rich in fears. There was a really wonderful coincidence of pretty much exactly what I was talking about earlier on last week, when Ash Wednesday fell on the same day as Valentine's Day. And I think that's a very convenient expression of the complex meshing of joy and sorrow, positivity and negativity, as well as presenting an existential dilemma about whether or not it was liturgically correct to buy chocolates for my wife. And in the end, romance triumphed, and I did buy those chocolates. But I did feel a little bit of a sense of guilt, every time I ate one of these chocolates, which might also prove my point that even in the joy of chocolate eating, there can sometimes be a complex form of pathos of suffering. So Bonhoeffer has a letter of joy, as it's known, and it's in the Letters and Papers collection. And he speaks of the sort of joy that exists that knows nothing at all of the heart's pain, anguish, and dread. He says this joy doesn't last. It can only numb a person for a moment. So the joy that exists that knows nothing of pain, anguish, and dread doesn't last. That might be a bit of a difference between happiness and joy. It can only numb a person for a moment. Whereas the joy that has gone through the poverty of the manger, he said, and the agony of the cross, that is the joy that is invincible and irrefutable. This is my point that I made earlier on, that to think about the passion of joy means thinking theologically about joy. And Bonhoeffer's doing exactly that. He's seeing the joy of God that has gone through the poverty of the manger and the agony of the cross. And the dynamic of through there, I think, is important. For joy doesn't stay in the suffering of the cross. It doesn't stay in this pathos. But this suffering is worked through as it's drawn into a relationship of abundance and the fullness of God. But there is a sense in which, at least for a moment, in some strange, brief and unfinished way, joy itself is wounded. That's what Bonhoeffer's trying to say. Now you can see these two pictures. I've just got back from Berlin. This is when I was writing the paper on the aeroplane, and it was at a theology conference. And if you ever go to Berlin, you can take an excursion just out of the city to go to Bonhoeffer's house. And it's a museum, and they've got a great exhibition downstairs. And you can go upstairs to his study, and these are a couple of pictures from his study. This is the very desk that the letter that I've just cited was written, because he wrote it just before he went into prison. And you get a real sense, actually, this was the very house that he was arrested from. and you climb all of these stairs, and you can just imagine the forces coming up those stairs and arresting him and taking him away from his beloved books and letter writing. But it's really worth doing if you ever get a chance to go to Berlin and get a real sense of what it would have been like for his house to be raided and to be arrested. And I was rereading his biography, not his autobiography. And, you know, he had 18 visits after he was arrested, 18 visits while in Tegel prison from his fiancée. He just got engaged by the time he was arrested. And he had 18 visits. And he speaks about the immense joy that comes from Maria, who's his fiancée, coming to prison to meet him. But he also speaks about how each of those visits, each of those 18 visits, were in a sense tinged by the sadness of 18 painful farewells, and especially towards the end, the increasing awareness that their wedding plans, and he writes about this in his letters, how they're planning their wedding. And he's really nervous that his parents aren't going to like his fiancée, but they turn out to really like her, which would have brought him more joy, I should think. But there's this increasing awareness that their wedding plans aren't going to be realised. Each of those meetings were in some sense tinged with sadness, however much joy that they brought. Splinters of the cross get lodged in joy as joy passes through the cross, as a reminder that joy is experienced, I think, as much as a sign of the fallen state of the world than as a sign of its foretaste of its redemption. So every experience of joy is kind of laced with longing for the better world that it foretastes, grieving for what it's not, and coming with the deepening realization of the contradictions of life. It has this lingering sense that as much as joy is an experience of the abundance of the good life, you know, whatever it is that makes us feel fully alive, joy is also that which brings us into the starkest confrontation with the tension between the way the world is and the way the world should be. And that itself, I think, says something about, you know, the complexity of joy as both being fully humanizing but also tinged with a sort of sadness that the world as it is isn't the world as it should be. So the passion of joy here isn't simply positive. It's not just boxed into a singular feeling. That helps to overcome the problem of positivity I mentioned earlier. But it also helps to avoid the political problem of joy. Joy, if it includes within itself a certain sort of suffering, then joy is also a really strong motivator for action. To be overjoyed doesn't override other emotions, but intensifies them. So the more you feel joy, the more you desire justice and peace and reconciliation, the more you're energized to build alliances of joy with others to overcome the suffering that blocks the flow of joy in the world. It intensifies and encourages action in order to close the gap, as it were, between the world as it is, full of despair, and the world as it should be, full of peace, justice, and love. And I wonder whether that's part of what 1 Peter meant by the indescribable nature of joy. That joy exceeds both the limits of words, but also the limitations of categories, such as positive emotion. Joy isn't about painlessness, having uninterrupted enjoyment, being continually comfortable, or avoiding suffering. Instead, it's a source for passionate action. It charges our bodies for resisting despair in order to bring about the peaceable ends joy anticipates. In order so that one day the pathos of joy will lift, the suffering will cease, the ambiguity will be resolved, and we finally enter into the complete joy of the Lord. But for now, we're caught, I think, in this tension between the world as it is and the world as it will be. And that's me. Thanks very much.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Ash. There's a lot there for us to engage with. We're going to now have answer and question sessions. There will be roving mic going around. If you have a question, do put your hands up, and then the mic will get to you. Well, we got one there. I was going to start off with a question of my own, and that is the reference to Charles Wesley's hymn, Joy of Heaven to Earth Come. That's really interesting. Charles Wesley, there's not much written about Charles Wesley, but one of the recent work done by on Charles Wesley is a wonderful work by Australian scholar Joanna Cruikshank, and it's called Pain, Passion and Faith.
Right.
And one of the things that she does is really to survey through Wesley's hymns and poetries the theme of suffering.
Okay.
And in relation to joy. And she argues that Charles Wesley wrote some of his poetry hymns with these themes in order to enable early Methodists to engage with the experience of suffering and pain in the world. Bearing in mind that most of the places that both John and Charles engaged with were places of margins in the mining pit area and in the northeast. And so I think one of the questions that I want to pose to you is, given that much of what we know about Charles comes through his poetry, his hymns and things, how might liturgy help us or form us in the dialectics of suffering that you have shared?
Yeah, I think this is one of the real challenges that I have about writing about joy. As soon as you write about joy, you kind of lose joy. Joy becomes quickly quite boring, and that's a real fear that I've got. And it says something about the nature of theological writing, and whether you can do justice to, how can you do justice to the indescribable nature of joy? And also, you just can't. And there's something about joy that's so intensely particularizing that when I talk about the things that bring me joy, you might not relate, because it's who I am. It's what makes me who I am. So I think a better genre, actually, of theology is through hymns and through the liturgy to express the inexpressible, right? And this is why Charles Wesley was such a genius, because he knew that in order to form people's minds, you need to get to the mind through the heart, through the affections. John Wesley, his heart was strangely warmed, and there's a strong theology of the affections that runs through Methodism, and it's something about, I think, the significance of hymns to form us and to form us together in communities. This is why I'm really interested in the social spaces for joy. That joy is something that's intensely particularizing, but it's something that's shared, and it's shared together. I think, the movement of the liturgy, it would also, quite neatly map onto some of the things that I'm saying here, because, liturgy is generally the movement of salvation history from sin through to salvation and redemption. And the liturgy kind of is a program of formation, along those lines. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to the book is the extent to which joy isn't immune from the dynamics of sin. Everything is caught up and bound up in sin. I told you theologians were a bleak bunch of people. But joy doesn't escape sin. Nothing can escape sin. So that then presents the question whether joy itself needs to be formed and reformed. And the great gift of the Christian tradition, I think, is that the liturgy does a really good job of helping people to be formed for glory, to glory, through glory. And whether then the liturgy is the most appropriate place for doing the sort of thing that I'm describing here.
And the rich resources in the Psalms around lament and those sort of
Yeah,
things.
it's interesting. Walter Brueggemann, who's the great Old Testament scholar, he's got this essay called The Costly Loss of Lament.
Yes.
And he says, there's a real problem within, again, American Protestant church culture that doesn't allow spaces for despair. It doesn't allow spaces for lament, as the psalmist puts it. It's really interesting that he was writing that essay at the same time as the positive psychology, the happiness industry was arguably at its height. And I think you could see, the need for Brueggemann to write about the costly loss of lament is saying something about church experience that maps with Peter Berger's terrifying imagery of too many smiling faces in church.
I struggle, when you've done a pastoral visit during the week and you visit Mary, who has been told she's got cancer, or John, who is struggling with some form of mental health, and all kinds of struggle. And then you come to church on Sunday morning, the call to worship begin, or give thanks to the Lord for He is good. Yeah. And you can see the mismatch between people's lived experience and the things that people bring, and where the preacher is oblivious.
And that's exactly the difficulty of writing about joy. How do you do it in those contexts?
Right, that's enough of me. Over to you for questions.
As more than one, as a preacher, and as more than one of us struggling with next week's set gospel reading from Mark 9, I wonder whether you'd offer us a helpful comment on Jesus being recorded as or reported as saying, if you want to follow me, if you want to be close to me with glory, that you've got to take up your cross, the cross of suffering, in order to reach the glory when the Son of Man returns in the glory of the Father. Whether you'd comment on the trajectory between the balance between sharing something of glory now and working through the experience of pain and joy on the journey carrying the cross in order to be part of the glory. I suppose it's the time frame that catches modern people out, that we tend to want to know, well, how long ahead is that? Anyway, just...
How long ahead is...
Well, how long... Where is glory in the return of... It's an eschatological question, although people don't like the word, and I don't either. But, where is this infinitely distant future glory? Yeah. And what do we think we're doing when we're trying to go there? And how is the suffering and the joy related there? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question, a really difficult question too. I mean, the Westminster Catechism has this. Its first question is what's the chief end of all things, and its answer is to glorify God and to enjoy God forever. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about eschatology. Eschatology will be all about glory and all about joy. But I think it also says something about the means to the end. How do we get to the end? And ends, this is why eschatology is really important, because it does determine not just the things that will be, but how we will live our lives today. And it's suggestive that the Westminster Catechism starts there, saying really that in order to get to the end of glory and joy, you need to be practicing glory and joy in the world today. Not in such a way that, as I've tried to demonstrate, that gets in the way of suffering. It might help to make meaning of suffering in I hope, a theologically responsible way. But it does say something about the need to be trained in glory, or formed in glory, which relates to Moses' point around the role of the liturgy and prayers and songs. These are all forming us for glory. But the reality of the Christian life is that it will involve suffering, because we live here in the world that suffers. One of the chapters that I'm hoping to include in the book is is something on the art of despairing well. And what I mean by that is that we've lost the art of despair. And despair is something that, again, that you need practice at. And you need to be formed to despair in such a way that doesn't lead you to think that the suffering that's there in the world and part of the Christian tradition is all that the Christian tradition will speak about. Suffering will end. That's the promise that we're all living and working towards. And how do you despair, in the world between now and then? I think is a really kind of critical issue. That's not answering your question, but I am really relieved that I'm not preaching next week. It's a great question.
We got a question.
It's not a question, it's an observation. I'm not a theologian or a preacher, but as a guinea pig sitting in the audience, I don't know if it's your own phrase, but the thing that's really stuck with me and that I will take away with me is when you said, joy has splinters of the cross embedded in it. And when you came out with that phrase, it really brought what you were saying to me together. So it's my observation that I'd like to thank you for and take away and give back to you. So
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's really kind. And not to contradict Moses, but I do say in my lectures, comments and just ideas are as valid as questions. And you are a theologian, just for the record. Evagrius of Ponticus, and I've spent a lot of time with Evagrius. He's a very ancient, 4th century theologian. He says if you're a theologian, you pray, and if you pray, you're a theologian. And I think there's some real wisdom in that. So we're all theologians if we all pray. But thank you. I'm encouraged by that.
Okay. I'll request him here to Jeb there, and then.
Thank you for the lecture. For me, for the construction of what joy is all about. Now, you did say that joy takens as it spreads, and also there can be joy fatigue.
Yeah.
So my question is, can one be joyful of nothing, or does it have to be linked to a particular experience? To manifest, especially in the context of the Lent period. Yeah. In practical application. During this time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's been a really interesting move in theological anthropology, which kind of discusses some of the things that you're raising. Theological anthropology is really interested in who humans are and what it means to live lives in this world. One of the central categories in theological anthropology is always the Imago Dei, the image of God. And there's been a really interesting move, I think, that shifts thinking about the image of God as a noun. What is the image of God? Who has it? What does it look like? How do you not lose it? All of those sorts of questions that has animated theological anthropology from the beginning. To think about the image of God as a verb. So what does it mean to image God in the world? And you can do that with glory. What does it mean to image the glory of God in the world? It's one thing to have glory, to be given glory by God, the God of glory, but how does one express it, to use your term at the end, to the world? This kind of contradicts a little bit the Peter Berger stuff that I was talking about, but I've got a chapter in the book on smiling for joy. And this is to prove my point that theologians really are a grumpy bunch of people, because in the history of Christian tradition, no one, and I really mean this, no one has spoken positively of smiling, unless I'm mistaken, unless you can come up with, I don't know if smiling features in any of Wesley's hymns or anything. Anyway, whilst you ponder
it will probably be there, but
it'll be probably there.
I can't think of any straight from my head.
Smiling is often indexed to experiences of joy. So it's not only how we feel, the passion of joy, it's not just a feeling, it's not just something that's within us, but it overflows, kind of bubbles up out of us and is expressed to the world as a smile. And the smile, I think, is extraordinarily rich theologically. And I've had a whole lot of fun thinking about the smile. When I first started thinking about the smile, I had some grant money to spend about a year doing not much more than just thinking about the smile. And it was a great year. It was the year after lockdown, and this is a great way to spend it. Anyway, the funding came with some money to spend to converse with psychologists. It was a kind of science and religion project, and basically I had to recruit 3 smile scientists, and there are such a thing as smile scientists, and they're all in America, and I had £1,000 to spend on each smile scientist. So I was writing these emails, and I was writing to these very, significant smile scientists in the States, saying basically, would you be my friend for a year, and I'll give you £1,000. And it really worked. They all said yes. Academics answered emails within a matter of hours. And if you're ever short of friends, just buy them. £1,000 will buy you a year's worth of friendship. But we spoke, over the course of that year about how amazing the smile is. And this was coinciding with the birth of my first daughter, Lucy. She was born in April 2020. So she's a full-on lockdown baby. And the idea of the child's first smile is nothing short of the grace of God. It's the most amazing thing. And it was so interesting to reflect about my experience of seeing, a baby smile from a very, very early age. And there's a lot of debate in scientific literature as to whether this is just, the passing of wind or something, or whether it's an actual smile. And scientists are actually disagreed over whether or not it is a genuine smile, but there are some who think it is a smile from a very early age, from a matter of weeks, and we're born with all the muscles to smile, unlike any other facial expression. And that got me thinking about, why does a baby smile? Is it something that this baby's just born with? Is it a kind of form of social development? It's probably a bit of both. But think of the dynamic. When you smile at a baby, the baby smiles, and what do? You smile back. And this is an example of the abundance of joy, because your joy, which is already an intense positive emotion, is further intensified through that dynamic of smiling. Theologians, as I said, haven't really thought through this relationship of the smile, and in fact, up until around the 13th century, you'd only see the smile referenced in material culture, so I'm talking about kind of on statues and in literature, on the faces of devils and gargoyles and devilish figures. And this goes back to the early origins of the smile, which is associated not with joy but with fear. It's when primates, showed their teeth in order to say back off. So here you've got a facial expression that goes on this massive swing from intense negative emotion to intense positive emotion. In the 13th century, one of the theologians who did write about joy was Dante, the great poet. And in his pilgrimage to paradise, his account of the vision of God, when he goes on this arduous journey, is the smiling God. So he gets to paradise and he's confronted with the smile of God, which, of course, makes him smile back. So there is this kind of amazing dynamic, I think, in the smiling, which kind of references joy, but can also be a way of imaging God's glory in the world. And that's what I mean about joy can be a very everyday, normal thing that then extends and enhances and intensifies the experience of joy. So in terms of expressing joy, in terms of the kind of practical relevance of it, joy can be both something that's quite abstract, actually. How do you really talk about joy? It's indescribable, but also very, very concrete and something very social, and is there in the most ordinary of things, like the smile. Have you thought of a Wesley smile reference?
But I haven't thought of Wesley's, but one of the things that I was doing just last night was reviewing the New Testament word on joy.
Yeah.
And one of the most common words is the word carry.
Yeah.
And you could almost group three phases of it in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And one of it is what you might call joy because of.
Yeah.
Because of the wonderful sunset.
Yeah.
Because of, you've won, £1 million lottery.
Yeah.
The sort of things in creation, in human relationship that releases joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, back to the whole question about emotion.
Yeah.
But in the New Testament, it's usually because creation itself is built into it some form of capacity of joy.
Yeah.
Sunset.
Yeah.
That brings joy to them.
Yeah, the trees will clap their hands in joy. So the Greek word actually for joy isn't a million miles away from the word from which we get charity. And joy and charity in the tradition kind of go hand in hand, I think. But yeah, thanks.
I think one or two more questions. Oh, the gentleman at the back, and then we go one at the front.
I've got a question because you mentioned, quite interestingly, you mentioned that you'd been to America and how this pressure to be joyful.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned a couple of people from Germany.
Yes.
And you've been to Berlin.
Yeah.
And as a person, I'm quite interested in Germany. I can speak, not so sharp, I can speak some German, understand some German. And the interesting thing, you've got America, which is very outward going, all social media. Oh, I'm happy, pressure to show how happy you are.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the little bit I know about Germany, I know two things. Number one is the fact they are a very blatantly Christian country nowadays. They don't open Sundays and a lot of other things like that. And they're quite Christian. I regret to say it, in some ways more Christian than us. And the other thing is, in terms of social media, there's a lot more of a culture of privacy, so they're less likely to do every move on Facebook, whatever. Yeah. So do the Germans, or do societies have less social media, slightly more traditional approach, experience joy differently to, say, people in America? Is their concept different, and which one, in your opinion, which type of society seems to have more better understand? That's what I'm getting at.
And don't mention anything about British.
No, that's really interesting. So I was in Berlin last week, and my German's really bad, actually. And I say this a lot of regret because I studied a German for my PhD. I studied Karl Barth, who wrote in German. And I remember in my first supervision, my supervisor said, if you want to be a first-rate theologian, you need Greek, you need Latin, you need Hebrew, you need French, and you need German. And I said, what do you need to be a second-rate theologian? And he said, stick with English. And that's pretty much what I did. I think your point really is that joy is, I said earlier on, intensely particular. And it is different, of course, in different cultures, in different contexts, in different communities. There's been some really interesting work that looks at kind of cross-cultural psychology stuff. And where there isn't a shared language, people tend to smile more as a way in, as a way of resonating with people. And I think that's quite a curious thing. But also within that discourse, the smile can mean many, many different things. It can mean, as I'm talking about it in the book, as the symbol of joy par excellence. But it can mean a whole bunch of other stuff too. And there's big money, actually. This is why smile scientists are a lot better off than theologians. Because they're all brought in by big businesses to help out with, for example, Chinese and American trade negotiations in order to help with the kind of social dynamics of those sorts of things. Which is basically to say that that we all know that emotion, however you're going to talk about it, is part of the society in which we live, and therefore is shaped by that society. And when you move around different communities, different societies, it's of course going to take different directions and different distinctions. As to whether the Germans are more joyful than others, I don't know. I need to. What do you think?
Well, I think they express things a bit differently, because they express things differently in the sense that they even to the sense that they can be joyful, but they might come across as sombre, but also the fact that the main point being that because I know from watching things they are much more careful about social media, about privacy, they've got perhaps, I wonder if they had less pressure to actually, I've got to show how happy, I'm living wonderfully, which is very much a culture in America and to a lesser extent here. Yeah. And that was the main point. And also the fact that if one's more of a blatantly Christian society, does that increase one's understanding and feeling of joy as distinct from just temporary happiness? That's what I was trying to
This is another kind of big difference between kind of joy and happiness. I think joy can't be measured in the way that happiness can. So you see at the end of each year there's some, data sheet that's produced that describes the most happy nation, and it's usually a Scandinavian country, I think. Denmark, is it? Yeah. But there is some work that's looked at kind of gradations of positivity that has, and it basically works west to east in terms of those kind of measurement categories, with America being the most obviously happy. It's the pursuit of happiness, it's the American dream, it's all of that. And then things get slightly different the further you move from America. But, there is, I think that's the problem of positivity again, or when joy is only positive. I think it can be deformative as well as it can be formative. And maybe some of the culture of happiness is suggesting something that's problematic or difficult or something going on there.
One thing I know about German is that reading German text is not joyful. It's very complex. Right, Roger, one more from Roger.
Thank you for your lecture. It's just a few thoughts that went through my mind during the lecture.
Yeah,
hopefully there's a question at the end of it.
Sure.
The thing that came to me was that joy is a gift from God, but is there not a responsibility, a Christian responsibility, in enjoying joy?
Yeah.
And I'm sort of thinking about that we shouldn't keep it to ourselves. Joy enables us individually to be equipped to do pastoral work and to share that joy with others.
Yeah.
And sort of acknowledging that joy is not a permanent thing, and there'll be times when we won't be joyful, we'll be suffering, and those that we minister to may well minister back to us. So I just wonder whether there's also another book, The Responsibility of Joy, and whether you sort of thinking of that as the next book.
Well, Reciprocity of Joy.
Yeah, that's a good... Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that churches do, and this is why I was genuinely interested in these older Anglicans, however difficult they are to find.
We've got a few here. You might...
But, my grandmother, for example, she's gone to church all of her life, and she's got this idea. She goes to church and she prays for her grandchildren. There's a sense in which there's a vicariousness. She's doing something on behalf of those who can't be there to pray with her. It hasn't quite occurred to me, but I wonder whether you could do a similar sort of thing in terms of holding joy in church for those who cannot hold joy in their own lives, and whether that's also part of the mission and ministry of the church, whether it's to be a sort of beacon, of joy in the midst of a despairing community, to say that also joy isn't just, if it's just an emotion, then you have to yourself have it. But if it's broader than that, if you can speak of it in terms of a passion or whatever else is broader than an emotion, perhaps there is a strange sort of sense in which you can do it on behalf of someone else. It's a bit like, Paul's idea that you cannot pray as you ought. And that doesn't bother Paul. He says it in Romans, you cannot pray as you ought. And yet he writes lots of stuff about prayer. And he says you cannot pray as you ought. And that's not a problem because it's Jesus Christ who is praying for us. It's the Spirit who's interceding for us on our behalf. Prayer is a gift. Joy is a gift. And whether you can borrow some of those dynamics from prayer to think about joy, that's really interesting. And what was the title there for your suggestion? Responsible joy. Responsibility of joy. Yeah, and then it also comes with it's the gift that comes with responsibility. I think that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, thanks.
That proves the point why I think we should always have cake in church on every Sunday, because that really is sort of a great opportunity for joyful fellowship.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Ash. I think that is it. We've gone a little bit beyond our time. But thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot to think and reflect on the nature of joy in Christian discipleship and in relation to mission. What might joyful mission looks like for us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. I hope you go joyfully into the world to love and serve the Lord as disciples of the one who goes towards the cross in sorrow and in suffering, but look forward to the eschatological joy to come when we shall share that heavenly banquet and the heavenly feast with the Lord. Thank you very much. Go well.
Thank you.